Part I. Issues in Living Color. Chapter 2. Issues as Forks in the Road. No doubt you've encountered the word issue with great frequency since you started law school, and you've probably figured out by now that it means different things in different contexts. When writing opinions, judges use the word as shorthand for a question we must answer in order to decide this case. Attorneys drafting briefs, by contrast, often use the word as a tool of advocacy. To recall an old joke, when the law is against him, a lawyer will try to make an issue out of the facts. When the facts are against him, he'll attempt to make an issue out of the law. And law students struggling with case briefs for their first-year courses surely suspect that issue is just another name for that unfathomable formula their professors consult to divine whatever it is that the case under discussion is really about. So it should come as no surprise to you that the word has yet another meaning in the context of a law school examination. The typical exam question will tell a story that presents some sort of hypothetical dispute. The story may be as brief as a sentence or two, or it may go on for 2 to 3 pages. The question then asks you to identify or spot the issues that would have to be resolved if the dispute became a lawsuit. In this context, we believe it is useful to think of issues as forks in the road of your analysis of the dispute. Like a fork you encounter in a real road, an issue presents you with a choice between 2 and sometimes more paths leading in different directions. But unlike a fork in a real road, exam forks are more like the divide in the yellow brick road, where the scarecrow tells Dorothy she can go both ways. Not only do exam forks permit you to travel in different directions at the same time. That is precisely what you should do, for the more paths your analysis explores, the better your answer will be. Let's begin with a variation on the famous Brooklyn Bridge hypothetical, where an offer to make a unilateral contract is revoked when the offeree is halfway across the Brooklyn Bridge or halfway up the flagpole that virtually every law student encounters in her first-year contracts course. Paul Patron offers Arlene Artiste $10,000 to paint a portrait of the Patron family. Artiste explains that her other commitments make it impossible for her to promise a completed work by a particular date, and Patron responds, "I don't want your commitment, I just want the portrait." After Artiste spends numerous hours doing preliminary sketches, but before she has put brush to canvas and begun the actual portrait, Patron advises her that he has changed his mind and is revoking the offer. What legal rights does Artiste have against Patron? What forks in the road are presented by this hypothetical? For one thing, you may recall that the traditional common law rule permits the offeror in the unilateral contract setting to revoke at any time before the offeree completes performance. If that rule is applied to the facts presented here, then Patron is perfectly free to back out of the deal, and Artiste has no right to stop him. But you may also recall that under the modern rule designed for this predicament reflected in 45 of the Second Restatement of Contracts, a binding option contra is created once the offeree begins the invited performance. And if that rule is applied, then Patron is prohibited from revoking as soon as Artiste starts the commissioned work. In sum, then, there is a fork in the road with respect to the law to apply to the facts stated in the hypothetical. If you take the road of the traditional rule, your analysis will lead to the conclusion that Patron is free to revoke his offer at any time before Artiste actually finishes the painting. But if you take the road of the rule under 45, your analysis will lead to the conclusion that Patron's offer is irrevocable as soon as Artiste begins her performance. To put the matter in more conventional terms, we would say that there is an issue presented by the question because there are 2 different legal rules that might apply to the facts at stake, and each of those rules will lead to a different result. We call this a rule vs. counter rule issue, but if that's too fancy, just think of it as a fork in the law. And we'll have lots more to say about issues of this sort in the next chapter. But our map of the forks in the road in the Artistepatron example is not yet complete. To continue with our analysis, it is pretty clear where the road of the traditional rule will lead. Since Artiste has yet to complete the portrait, Patron is perfectly free to revoke his offer. But the road of Restatement 45 leads to terrain that is more uncertain than our discussion has thus far acknowledged. True enough, under that provision, patron loses the right to revoke once artiste begins the invited performance. But is it clear on the facts before us that artiste has met that requirement? On the one hand, it can certainly be argued that artiste began the performance when she did the preliminary sketchwork. To an artist, such sketches are as much a part of portraiture as the brushstrokes on the final canvas, and thus from that standpoint artiste began the invited performance at the moment she started work on her first sketch. But on the other hand, patron asked for a family portrait, not a series of sketches in exchange for his promise of $10. Accordingly, you could argue that from his perspective, the invited performance would be limited to the actual painting of the commissioned portrait, and that the preliminary sketches were mere preparations for that performance. In sum, then, we have encountered a second fork in the road in the problem, and this one relates to the way we interpret the facts. If you take the road that interprets the performance sought from the standpoint of artiste's own understanding of her task, your analysis may lead to the conclusion that the preliminary sketchwork was indeed the beginning of performance, creating an option contract that in turn prevents patron from revoking his offer. But if you take the road that interprets the performance from the perspective of patron's focus on the end product he sought to purchase, your analysis may lead to the conclusion that artiste had not yet begun the invited performance, and that patron is accordingly free to revoke. To put the matter once again in more conventional terms, we would say that there is a second issue in this hypothetical quite apart from the rule vs. counter-rule issue we discussed earlier, because there are at least two plausible ways to interpret the facts presented, and each of those interpretations may lead to a different outcome. Not surprisingly, we call this issue a fork in the facts. We have good news and bad news, and then some more good news. The first bit of good news is that 99% of the issues you will encounter on law school exams will fall into one or the other of the two categories we've just identified. They will involve either a fork in the law or a fork in the facts. Indeed, as we will explain in Chapter 7, a pretty fair number will involve both kinds of fork at the same time. Thus, to coin a phrase, if you've seen two issues, you've pretty much seen them all. But now for the bad news. This insight will get you absolutely nowhere on a law exam unless you already know precisely which forks in the law and precisely which forks in the FAS to look for. Thus, you couldn't spot the forks in the road of the artiste-patron example unless you already knew that the common law permitted the offeror in the unilateral contract setting to revoke at any time before the offeree completed performance. B. That the second restatement, by contrast, protects the offeree once she begins performance. And C. That, even under the restatement approach, the protection the offeree enjoys during performance may not extend to activities that are mere preparations. And you wouldn't have had a clue about a B or C unless you had taken and studied pretty carefully during your contracts course. In sum, you can't even begin a search for forks in the road on a law exam until you've grasped the material taught in the course itself. If you were hoping for a shortcut, a way to avoid all the work it takes to engage that material seriously and make it your own, you'll have to pursue that quest elsewhere. But now for a little more good news. Each of the two kinds of issues we've identified, forks in the law and forks in the facts, appear on law exams in recurring patterns. And learning to recognize those patterns can help you to 1. Organize a course in preparation for an exam, 2. Identify the issues that you encounter on the final, and 3. Develop strategies for analyzing the issues you identify. We address each of these points at some length in Part Roman 2, Strategies for Issue Spotting, Analysis, and Argument. But we'll devote the remaining chapters here in Part I to exploring these recurring patterns and helping you learn to recognize them on your own. Before we turn to that task, however, WC have several important caveats about our forks in the road approach. First, we don't pretend for a moment that what we offer in this book is an exhaustive list of the issues that you will encounter on your law exams. Every area of law we've ever encountered has issues unique to it, and sophisticated lawyers who practice in even the most familiar areas, personal injury law, for example, are coming up with new ones all the time. What we've done here is to identify the issues you are most likely to encounter in the subjects most students study in law school. But for a life in the law, this is only a starting point. Second, for exam taking purposes, the most important issues of all are the ones that the professor stresses in your class. Most professors try to test what they teach, and so we cannot emphasize enough that the lessons you learn from this book, or for that matter from any commercial study guide, are no substitute for a mastery of your course material. Third, resist the temptation, however understandable it may be, to treat the patterns of issues we identify as answers you can memorize and regurgitate on law exams. The point is not to memorize them. It is rather to learn how to use them in particular contexts. We'll have a lot more to say about this in parts Roman 2 and Roman 3 of the book. But for now, just keep the following advice in mind. Utilize, don't memorize. Finally, keep your eyes on the prize. The point is not the proper classification of the issues you encounter on your exams. In the end, it really doesn't matter whether it's a fork in the law or a fork in the facts. Indeed, if you use the forks terminology on an exam, your professor is likely to think you have lost it completely and lapsed into baby talk. We are firmly of the view that it's easier to identify issues if you learn to recognize the patterns in which they appear, and we think that the forks approach is an extremely effective way to do that. But what matters most is that you learn to recognize and deal with issues on your own, and the right way to do that is whatever way works best for you.